Suicide Note by Mitchell Heissman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heissman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heissman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Separating facts from values. The objectivity of the historian becomes an issue with subjects besides the Holocaust, observed historian Yehuda Bauer, but a historian dealing with the Holocaust cannot avoid the issue. 1381. It is often assumed that Nazism was a gargantuan exercise in the naturalist fallacy. The Nazis, some assume, discarded certain Western conceptions of science and imposed certain unscientific value judgments. Yet how can one criticize the Nazis for being prejudiced without also maintaining value neutrality towards the Judeocide, the genocide of European Jewry? How can one claim to be objective if one exercises prejudice, prejudgment as to whether the systematic, industrialized genocide of the Jews was good or bad? If one is simply prejudiced against Nazism, this simply substitutes one set of prejudices against Nazi prejudices. To posit a value-free science is to assume that one can examine the Judeocide free of value judgments. To understand the Nazi genocide of most European Jews scientifically, or as objectively and as free from value judgments as possible, one must look at the Judeocide with the same methodology used in the physical or natural sciences. In this case, the science of sociobiology, and especially the theory of kin selection, is most appropriate to the subject matter at hand. The prohibition against value judgments in social science, wrote Leo Strauss, the great antagonist of modern political science, would lead to the consequence that we are permitted to give a strictly factual description of the overt acts that can be observed in the concentration camps and perhaps an equally factual analysis of the motivation of the actors concerned. We would not be permitted to speak of cruelty. 1382. What is a value? A value, according to Harvey Mansfield, is a verbal noun named for its source in valuing, a mysterious activity that takes place at a level below rationality. 1383. Sociobiology, however, has made step in discerning a kind of rationality in what has previously gone by the name of the irrational. When biological factors are incorporated into strictly factual descriptions of Nazi extermination camps, one can discern how specific behaviors, such as depositing Zyklon B into a gas chamber in Auschwitz, could be genetically adaptive. From a genetic standpoint, Martin Heidegger could be viewed as a gene-propagating machine, and his behaviors in support of Nazism thus become more comprehensible. The extirpation of millions of Jews by the Nazis during World War II may be similarly comprehensible as an extreme form of kin-selective behavior. If the events at Auschwitz can be understood as genetic adaptations, how valuable is this knowledge? In asking this, I am returning to the question of the possibility of a universal science. Is my very aspiration to a universal science explicable as the product of an international Jewish mind? Can a Jew give an account of Nazism that an authentic Nazi would view as beyond Jewish bias? Are Jewish accounts of Nazism necessarily prejudiced by a Jewish point of view? Does an authentic Nazi see something that a Jew, as a Jew, cannot? It appears that Hitler viewed Jews as a race with unalterable hereditary characteristics. Jewish behavior, in this view, could not be changed by learning or a change in upbringing. The Jewish problem, thus conceived, could only be solved by destroying the hereditary basis of Jewishness. If moral injunctions against killing human beings, moreover, were themselves facets of Jewish influence via Christianity, then killing Jews would be the ultimate killing of Jewishness. To consider the racial relativism of truth, and to therefore reckon that our truths may be destructive to an existential enemy, is a truth potentially destructive to me. To understand Auschwitz on the basis of kin selection could be considered irrational if I were to understand my own behavior on this same basis. Perhaps the so-called evil represented by the Nazis is a blind spot in objective thinking produced by a Jewish desire for survival. If so, perhaps the subjective desire for individual and group survival is the source of prejudice or bias, i.e. the prejudice toward life over death. In other words, this attempt at objectivity may conflict with an objective assessment of my own self-interest. The attempt to be objective, from my own point of view, would appear to lead to the projection of my own death as the price of objectivity on this matter. I have attempted to follow the internal logic of Hitlerism on the basis of socio-biological discoveries. I am not claiming that the destruction of European Jewry was good or bad. That would be the imposition of a value judgment. From the view of the conventional fact-value distinction, a Darwinistic understanding of nature does not dictate values. Darwin's theory does not directly imply any political program. Understanding biology in non-teleological terms would seem to leave one without prescriptive goals. To assume that evolution by natural selection provides a model for the way things should be, or ought to be, is often called the naturalist fallacy. However, the so-called naturalist fallacy, what is, should be, in one form, is another way of describing the principle of self-preservation. What exists should continue to exist. The naturalistic fallacy could imply the preservation of a gene, a trait, a culture, a socio-economic class, an individual life, etc. To attempt to not commit the naturalistic fallacy in a consistent manner could imply the negation of self-preservation. For example, a neo-Darwinian understanding of genetic fitness does not oblige one to maximize genetic fitness. One could choose the opposite goal of minimizing genetic fitness. A program of genetic self-preservation is not dictated by Darwin any more than a program of genetic self-extinction. A program of individual self-preservation is not dictated by a Darwinian understanding of life any more than a program of individual self-destruction. More generally, instead of choosing life, one could choose death. In other words, if facts and values can always be separated, this implies that the relationship between facts and values is arbitrary. Regardless of the facts, I can choose any values whatsoever. But are facts, in fact, only arbitrarily or randomly related to values? Can the theory of the separation of facts and values be tested empirically? If I am truly free enough to choose any values whatsoever, then I am free enough to choose death over life. However, a Darwinian view of life suggests that humans, like all animals, are built with biases that limit that freedom with biases towards genetically adaptive self-preservation. Just as rational thought leads to nihilism, or the arbitrariness of all values, empirical science gives reason to think that the world works in ways that are not completely arbitrary. If an evolutionary account of the human mind is correct, moreover, how can rationalism be fully separated from empiricism? The assumption of an unbridgeable distinction between facts and values is a claim. Can this claim be verified scientifically? Is the fact-value distinction a fact or value? If it is a value, could one just as easily choose any other value? Why should one value it over its opposite? If it is a value, then can one value the fact-value distinction for the sake of testing whether or not it is a fact? If the assumption that facts can always be separated from values is itself a fact, then why shouldn't it be subject to scientific, empirical methods just like anything else? What could be the empirical consequence of radically separating facts and values? For example, is it possible to value death, regardless of the supposed biological facts of self-preservation? Is it possible to separate facts from values to the point of self-destruction? Just as the evidence for Darwinian evolution does not dictate the value of maximizing inclusive genetic fitness over the value of minimizing inclusive genetic fitness, the evidence for Darwinian evolution does not dictate the value of self-preservation over the value of self-destruction. Just because can we explain scientifically why some choose one set of values, while others end up choosing different or incompatible values? If values are not totally arbitrarily related to facts, then the scientific attempt to demonstrate this would amount to a demonstration of the facts of values. It would amount, for example, to a socio-biological explanation of how the Western values of liberal democracy evolved. It would lead towards a socio-biological exploration of the relationship between facts and values. After all, how does one explain why some cultures tend to value the fact-value distinction, while others do not? Why is this distinction between facts and values valued in the secular West, The fact-value distinction has become practically sacred as a justification for the discrepancy between what Westerners think they know and what they want to do. A scientist ought to value the facts-value distinction, for this distinction is a fact. But is it a fact? Upholding the facts-values distinction would appear to be a moral position in the same sense that preferring truth to fiction or lies is a moral position. For the distinction must itself be valued. The fact-value distinction may only be a fact for those who value it. Not everyone is willing to value facts that clash with their values, especially facts that they perceived as clashing with the value of their own self-preservation. A problem the science of sociobiology has faced is the value of its findings to the liberal democratic political order. What, for example, is the value of a scientific finding that refutes the theoretical assumptions upon which the liberal democratic freedom of speech system is premised? The problem here is the value of facts, or, strictly speaking, interpretations, and the facts of values. For example, is the idea of human equality a fact or a value? If the idea that there are natural human rights built upon a reality of natural equality were taken seriously, it would mean, as political thinker Francis Fukuyama put it, there would be an inequality of freedom only because there was a natural equality of man, or, to put it more positively, the fact of natural equality demanded an equality of political rights. 1384. Sociobiology has refuted the more extreme claims of this argument that has its origins in a pre-Darwinian conception of the human. Its findings tend to chip away at the egalitarian premises underlying liberal democracy. Anyone who lives in such a regime cannot help but notice that democracy's egalitarian values are often exactly the opposite of what one might expect on the basis of sociobiological theory. One could imagine a society that evolved in a very different direction than this moderately egalitarian political form. It could have been otherwise. Yet liberal democracy conquered much of the post-Cold War world. How can one explain this? The entire notion of progressive equality goes hand in hand with the downplaying of biological factors. If one follows egalitarian progress backwards to its roots, one is led to the origins of equality itself. When one traces the genealogy of anti-racism movements in America, for example, one finds an implicit promotion of the idea that the revolution itself was not about anything like racism. Yet behind the American fear of looking at individual genealogies is a fear of looking too deeply at the genealogy of the revolution itself. Americans are the heirs of the subterranean fears of its founders. American egalitarianism is only a following out of the logical implications of a principle that originated in the revolution. When one grasps the origin of a revolution itself sociobiologically, however, then the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Only then can one fully grasp the incongruity of a direct application of kin selection and liberal democracy. When the revolution itself is understood sociobiologically, then an understanding of the sociobiological consequences of the revolution falls into place.